Day 36 to 12:20 a.m. Barangay Poblacion I, Real, Quezon. Like what Jones had stated before, the military had appeared. As usual, the authorities came late though. It had been the cliché of the military and police both in written literature and real life. At this time, Colleen and Joish had gotten out of the smelly toilet and the two unconscious teammates of them were brought out on stretchers the soldiers had. As the soldiers escorted away their target group, they used flashlights to light up the way, but they were trying too hard not to move the light outside of the path they needed to take outside the house. Mark had already finished with his business with the heads of the outlaws. He retrieved their abilities at the same time at the second floor of the house. Jones surely saw the blinding light coming from the second floor, but even if the soldiers asked, he had no reason to explain. This time, Mark watched the whole process. The military dealt with the aftermath of his battle with the outlaws while sitting on the roof of the house. Amihan sat on his shoulder as she looked at the soldiers below with interest. Even Mark found it funny that the military brought handheld searchlights and used it to light the area initially, but the soldiers stopped using those lights when they saw the vicinity of the house. The soldiers that were used to fighting and killing, especially the infected this past month, could not even stomach the scene where the bodies of the outlaws were brutally mangled and killed in a gruesomely inhumane way. Mark even saw a few that ran away and vomited the moment they lit up their searchlights around the house. "Dad!" Mark suddenly heard Colleen's voice and could not help but turn towards her direction. There, at the clearing of the dirt path north of the house, Mark saw Colleen hug a man in his 40s wearing a military uniform. Looking at the patched symbol on his shoulder, the man should a major in the military. No wonder the military would dispatch their soldiers for a private group. One of the members was actually a major's daughter. "Well, it's none of my business really," Mark muttered and laid his back on the roof. Since the military was here, he had already bagged his weapons. He wanted to rest, and it would be inconvenient if the heavy weapons were still on his body. His fight for tonight was already over and everything else had nothing to do with him, or it should have been. "Mr. Mark." His back had not even able to lay flat on the roof when Colleen, who knows how she knew where Mark was, called unto him. "Please, go down from there, I'll introduce my father." With Colleen's enthusiasm, Mark could not help but hesitate. Because of her tone and way of speaking, rather than introducing their savior to her father, it felt more like she was introducing her boyfriend. "Should I go down there, Amihan?" Mark turned his head to his left and looked at Amihan, who was sitting on his backpack and stretching her body while yawning. "Why are you asking me, my lord?" "Well, isn't it better if you go down there? You said before that you need something from those soldiers, right?" Amihan replied, which made Mark sigh and nod. It was then that Amihan added a few more unnecessary words. "Let's go down. If something happens, I'm right on your shoulder, you can rely on me." Mark only looked at her with his eyes half closed, as if he could rely on what she was saying. He then pulled the backpack so suddenly that Amihan fell from it before he jumped off the roof. "What is that for?" After landing on the yard, Amihan also landed on his shoulder, painfully caressing her bottom. "Mr. Mark, this is my father," Colleen said while pointing at the major. "Major Alfonso Bautista." Colleen's father introduced himself with a salute and extended his right hand towards Mark. Mark sighed. This gesture again. He was about to reluctantly accept the gesture when his hand was pulled forward and was clasped by the major's hand. Mark turned his head to the culprit, who was obviously Colleen. "You can't leave my dad awkwardly hanging, can you?" Ignoring Colleen, who was rather behaving spoiled, he looked at the face of the major, who had his eyebrows twitching as he looked at Colleen. With a sigh, Major Alfonso spoke. "Sorry about my daughter's behavior. I heard the circumstances. Thank you for saving my daughter and her friends." "You don't have to thank me. They're just lucky that I needed some information. That's all." "No, even if that's the case, you still saved them, so you still have my gratitude. If you needed something, I'll try to help if possible." Hearing that, Mark's eyes lit up. "Actually, I needed something." "What is it?" Major Alfonso asked while taken aback. He did not expect that Mark would want something immediately. You soldiers have a way to communicate with other military settlements, right? I wonder if you can help me contact Bay City. Bay City? That's pretty far, isn't it? Fortunately, if that's all, I can allow you to use our communication line once we return at the settlement. Mark became confused this time. Don't you soldiers use that satellite phone? You even know about that? I do. General Perez in Bay City. His daughter gave me one before, but it's with my group in Bay City. This time, not only Major Alfonso but also Colleen was taken aback. Mark had his group back in Bay City, which was at the west, while he was on the totally opposite side of the country. The father and daughter could not help but wonder what happened. The satellite connection stopped working a week ago. Right now, we are using a specialized transceiver connection to keep on communicating to other military settlements. The transceiver is nowhere compact and can only be used in the settlement. Is that so? All right. This time, Mark felt a little down. He thought that he would be able to communicate with May and the others already, but he still had to wait some more. Mark felt a tiny hand caressing his face. It looked like Emihan perceived the slight change in his thoughts. The father and daughter could not help but look at the little fairy on Mark's shoulder. This was the first time they were able to see a creature like this up close in their whole life. Mark, that fairy. Major Alfonso could not help but voice. Mark only raised his head straight and replied. A close companion. The conversation did not take long, and the father and daughter did not ask any more about Emihan as Mark tried to shut down the topic. Soon, the cleanup was done, although the cleanup only applied to the bodies of the mutators that would be taken to lab studies. They even took the heads Mark abandoned at the second floor of the house. Unexpectedly, no one questioned him for his gruesome way of killing the outlaws, which made him confused. While he was thinking of the reason, Jones came around and started pestering him once more. Mark did not have many interactions with foreigners even before the outbreak, but he was sure that not all Americans were as annoying as Jones. It even made him question the authenticity of his proclaimed line of work, as he more visualized mercenaries as stern people. Jones, on the other hand, behaved like your typical overly friendly neighborhood guy. For Mark, his work attitude during then fight as Ogre was more suitable, as he did not talk too much like this time. The military convoy left as early as possible due to many factors. It was already too late in the evening. The smell of blood in the area might attract strong evolved animals, and Tyson was in dire need of medical care. While everyone rode on their armored vehicles, Mark took a K Ninja black motorcycle from the vehicles of the outlaws and rode it. One of the reasons why he did so was to get away from Jones, while the other was because he was not a soldier. Riding inside a military vehicle when you were not a soldier made him feel more like he was being escorted somewhere than actually accompanying them. Besides, he enjoyed the cold breeze while driving outside more than the cold by damp air from the air conditioner inside their vehicles. Furthermore, the insides of military vehicles smelled more like metal and dusty, which was not good for Emihan. The convoy moved through the highway in the middle of the night. Though it was the middle of the night, it was more like almost dawn already. 15 minutes after they left the area of battle, Mark suddenly felt a jolt in his blood and mind. Even Oracle and Crimson inside his backpack felt that jolt. He looked to the left of the highway and saw that the Agos River was running side by side the highway in this area. Without further ado, he stopped his vehicle at the side of the road and jumped off from the highway. Emihan was also surprised to his sudden action and held tightly on his face as Mark vanished together with her in a puff of black mist. Oracle and Crimson was feeling restless. It was as if they were receiving a distress signal from somewhere. Hurrying, Mark found the source of the tugging feeling. There was a stray blood child in this area and was about to be squashed by a monkey holding a large log. Mark did not need to do anything, as Mark's sudden appearance shocked the monkey to the bone. It ran away while releasing the contents of its bladder in fear. Approaching the slow-moving and weakened blood child, Mark felt even more surprise. For sure, it was a wild blood child, but rather than the clear reddish blood color, it had a greenish-violet color, which somehow told Mark that it was poisonous. Mark injected his blood first and it was delightfully received. The color of the wild blood child became darker and the violet color was eliminated as it turned into more of a greenish dark red color. Unlike the trained blood children under Mark, this one obviously could only drag its body to move, which made it look even more pitiful. He picked up the new addition to his loyal entourage with great care. The number of the blood children was already low in the first place, and finding one here unexpectedly was a great thing itself. Still, Mark could not help but wonder how it was able to live this long and turn into a different color. The little critter was still weak and was rather a shy one, but it was really happy that it was not alone anymore and was clinging on Mark's arm like glue. While Mark was appeasing the new child, he immediately decided to name as Ivy, which meant both green and poisonous. Several shadows came down the slope from the highway to his position. Another one. Mark heard Colleen's voice, who was unexpectedly leading the group. Behind her was Jones, who had some sort of unexpected shock on his face when he saw Mark holding Ivy. He turned to Colleen as he heard her question. "You said, another one?" Yes. I saw him earlier. He had two more with different colors." Hearing that, Jones approached Mark, which made the latter frown. Jones suddenly approaching caused Ivy in his hands to flinch. "What do you want now?" Mark said in displeasure. "Do you know what these are?" Hearing Jones' question, Mark stared at him, waiting for him to elaborate further. A lot of these slimes had been washed downstream. Though it stopped several days ago and most slimes appeared to be dead, there were quite a few that were caught alive by the people in Death Valley Settlement, thinking that they are some sort of new creatures and were kept as pets. Mark frowned hearing that. Since the crime district was in Barangay Pamplona, he knew that Agos River passed by that barangay before the river connected to the ocean. He did not expect, though, that there were blood children that made it there alive. In any case, due to his blood connection to these poor souls, he felt that these blood children were his kin. Not to mention the innocent affection they gave after he retrieved them, which were not faked. Jones had just given him another reason to visit that dangerous settlement brimming with criminals. Day 36 to 2:39 a.m. Fami Real Infanta Road, Barangay Gumian, Infanta, Quezon. The military convoy Mark was driving with had already left the highway and turned southward in this smaller main road. As the end of the Marquina-Infanta highway was in Infanta itself, it was a huge detour just to turn several kilometers south after driving northward on the highway. Still, it could not be helped, as the military settlement was in the port of Real, which was more than 5 kilometers away south from the exit of the highway. As Mark drove his motorcycle, he had a lot in his mind. Not knowing, he had not only 2 but 3 reasons to go to the crime district in General Nakar, Quezon. When Jones informed Mark about the blood children washed away downstream to that settlement, it also gave Mark the chance to ask about the hideout of the outlaws and finish his business with them. Unexpectedly, there was no hideout nearby but just some temporary outpost. The main headquarters of the outlaws was the Death Valley settlement itself. These outlaws were not just outlaws but also slave traders, and their victims were the ones being sold there as slaves. According to Jones, these outlaws had been operating on the highway since more than a week after the outbreak. Their operation had cut off the arrival of survivors that were going to the military settlement in Port of Real and the private settlement in the eastern Infanta coast, and that was the reason why Jones was sent to investigate undercover. Since there were also spies within the military settlement, the higher-ups were secretly planning an attack to stop the outlaws and were going to move in several days, but they did not expect that the major's daughter would get caught in the new scheme of the beasts. This forced them to move today, but still, Mark had beaten them to the punch. As for the treatment of the blood children, it was the worst. Since they did not have Mark's method of taming them, the blood children they caught were all aggressive and were put into cages, aquariums and fish bowls, and were kept as ornamental pets. Unlike cats and dogs or even evolved animals, these strange creatures had higher value but lesser cost to keep as pets, not to mention that unlike dogs, the blood children did not make noises like barks that could attract enemies and the infected. Retrieving the blood children from their poor environment became another important thing for him to do. Of course, it was not only in Death Valley, but there were also blood children being kept in the other 2 settlements. In the Infantas settlement, it seemed they were also being treated as pets, but the treatment was better, while in the military settlement, the blood children were being kept as specimen for study. Either way, he planned to retrieve them all. Under the hands of everyone else, these were just unknown creatures with no purpose, but for him, they were his close kin that could help him in many ways. Yawn. Someone's yawn disturbed his line of thinking. It was not coming from Amihan, who was sitting behind the windscreen of the motorcycle, but the woman who was riding on his back, Colleen. When he received the signal Ivy let out, it seemed that it caused quite a disturbance when he suddenly stopped and jumped down the slope of the highway. To prevent him from doing so once more, or at least inform the other vehicles of the reason, Jones and Colleen volunteered to ride on his motorcycle. He was quite displeased with the arrangement, but as it was to prevent miscommunication, since it looked like he suddenly tried to leave before. Due to that, he could only acquiesce and chose Colleen over Jones. Rather, he would never try to ride in one vehicle with Jones since he found him really annoying. Of course, Mark choosing Colleen caused some silent protest from Joish, but it could not be helped. Mark would not trust some unknown person to ride behind him. Besides, aside from behaving like a spoiled brat, Mark approved of Colleen's personality. Still, Mark was having a hard time gauging whether Colleen was a powerful person or not. After all, she managed to find him on the roof before without effort, and she was also the first person to notice him in the highway. Not to mention that she even managed to outrun other soldiers and even Jones when they chased after he jumped down the highway. Well, what was good was that Colleen did not talk too much from behind him. It seemed that she knew how to read people and saw that Mark was not really fond of talking. That was why, aside from a few mild questions, she was silent almost the entire time. Still, it was kind of problematic. Colleen was holding too close on his back. The motorcycle was already built for a single rider anyway, and that was why the seat was short in the first place. Since she was riding behind him, Mark had to put his backpack in front to be able to accommodate two riders comfortably. Mark felt it rather uncomfortable though. There was two soft mounds pushing on his back from time to time, and the glare he was receiving from Joish on the other vehicle was intensifying over time. The woman in question, however, seemed to find the way Mark was feeling uncomfortable rather amusing, and she was sometimes pushing her front on her own just to see how Mark would react. She was almost caught and played with several hours ago, but she was doing something inviting right now. Mark could not help but think of how women were more of strange creatures than the blood children. It was still uncomfortable though. Can you stop that? Why? Other men should be smiling from ear to ear, but you're not. Colleen said in all innocent curiousness. Then, you should have made those dirty guys this afternoon smile. Maybe it's a mistake to help you back then. Mark said in a tone that as if he was regretting saving her group. No, I'm not that kind of woman. Then, what are you doing now? It can't be helped. The seat is too short, Mark sighed. Of course she was lying. He could tell as she was basically touching him since she was holding on his waist. In the end, he decided to just ignore her. Leaving the other thoughts behind, Mark could not help but admire the countryside scenery here. Even though it was still dark, the outline of the farm fields at the roadside and the old-styled houses were giving an atmosphere far more different from the cityscape. It was a pity that there were no crickets and fireflies anymore to bolster the ambience. It would have been great if those insects were present in their normal sizes. If the fireflies and crickets were present this time, however, it would surely be a disaster since most insects had grown unreasonably larger now. The way to the military settlement was not without peril. Since the road was just on the eastern foot of the mountain ranges, evolved animals lingered on the road looking for prey, which was the infected. Unfortunately for these animals, these parts of Quezon were almost cleared of infected since the total population in the area was small in the first place. Due to the lack of infected in the main roads, some of the animals switched to attacking the survivors that passed through this area, while some animals moved to more populated areas. Unfortunately, one of the most populated areas here in Quezon was actually the port of Real. Due to that, the military settlement that was still struggling to reduce the number of infected near the settlement was also receiving attacks from evolved animals day and night. Although it gave the settlement a secure source of food, it was also dangerous. When they were unlucky, losing a dozen of people was not surprising in a large-scale attack. During the time Mark was following along the military convoy, they received several attacks from enlarged dogs and bats. The animals were dealt quickly and the carcasses were brought back by the soldiers to increase the settlement's food supply. Almost an hour and a half passed after they exited the highway. The port of Real could be seen off the coast. The majority of the town was built in a small peninsula branching off the east coast of the barangay Ungos, Real, Quezon. Only less than a fourth of the peninsula was connected to the mainland, which was the southwestern part. As for the rest of the border of the peninsula, it was surrounded by water. The military built tall walls on the southwestern part which separated the entire peninsula from the threats coming from the mainland. The entirety of the peninsula now belonged to the military, which was just a kilometer in length and was just 200 meters in the widest part. The military convoy passed through the only bridge on the western side of the peninsula. Since the bridge was also broken off from the mainland, the convoy waited for the movable metal bridge to lower down before the whole convoy was able to enter the settlement. Upon entering, everyone was subjected to inspection and were checked if they were not infected or bringing an infected inside the settlement. The only exception was the vehicle that was carrying Tyson and Alana, who were both unconscious, and was driven away immediately. Even though the weapons were not confiscated, every weapon was still checked by the personnel on site. The soldiers were not subjected to this, but since Mark was not, he had to bring his weapons and backpack in the checking area. It should have been just a checking of weapons and checking of his belongings, which Mark was not against, but when he took out the contents of his bag, it suddenly turned into a circus, as the gallery around the checking area, whether soldiers or not, were watching him. The reason was, of course, the fairy on his shoulder, the 3 blood children, and the whole set of darkness shade. Even the crossbow on his arm and the katana on his waist became a debate to the onlookers. Mark found it both annoying and amazing when he dumped the darkness shade set in front of the soldier checking the weapons. The soldier looked at the shield hiding the other weapons inside and turned back to Mark in confusion, as if asking what in the world was Mark making him check. The personnel for checking the non-weapons was a young female cadet, and she shrieked out loud when she opened the container that had the 3 blood children. Since the container was opened, Oracle and Crimson, who had no idea what was going on outside, sprang out of the container, scaring the hell out of the poor female cadet. Luckily, she did not push away the container and the blood children, or it would not have ended peacefully. Emihan, on the other hand, was clinging too hard on Mark's neck. Since she was an unusual but beautiful creature, the stares on her were too much. Mark sighed. It was one of the things he hated and expected in a settlement owned by the military. The place was busy and noisy. Even though it was still late in the evening and morning was still hours to go, the place was brimming with people. "Is everything fine?" Major Alfonso approached Mark with his daughter, who seemed to be scolded since she was somehow behaving better right now. To his question, however, Mark sighed. "You think we're fine?" The major looked around and shook his head, since there were a lot of onlookers in the vicinity. "Everything you are carrying is very unusual, so it's expected to gather this much attention." Mark did not reply, but the displeasure was apparent on his face. Due to that, the major could only tell his men to drive away the onlookers and forced the personnel on the desk to do their job faster so that the convoy could move on. Finally, the entry was finished, and it was a true entry. For the first time after the apocalypse commenced, Mark finally stepped into an official survivor settlement. Not just a temporary one like the elementary school in Bacoor, Cavite, but a real settlement designated by the government. Day 36 to 5:20 a.m. Meeting room, Port of Real Settlement Headquarters, Barangay Ungos, Real Quezon. It was early in the morning and the sun had not even peaked on the eastern sea yet, but the settlement was already busy. Most of the activities involved the military, while some were the private groups going to start their day early. As for the refugees, many of them woke up early to work on the tasks given by the military within the settlement. It was to ensure that they would have better food for the day. The Port of Real Settlement was divided into 2 sectors. The first was the residential area sector, which was the majority of the settlement, and the second was the military sector, which occupied the entirety of the commercial port area at the northeast of the settlement. Since the roads inside the settlement were narrow, the vehicles owned by private groups could not be driven inside unless they were leaving the settlement or going back to their dwellings after returning. It was to prevent road blockage during emergencies where the soldiers needed to use the roads to respond to the area location of the emergency. As for the higher-ups of the settlement, they had their own duties to fulfill and most of them should have been resting this early, but this time, everyone was informed to report at the headquarters for a sudden meeting. It was to address several issues that rose because of the incident that involved the daughter of a major. There were 10 people currently in the room sitting around a rectangular table. 5 people were from the military, 1 from the U.S. forces and 4 from the local politicians. Among these people was Major Alfonso and the U.S. mercenary, Jones Galley. Sorry for gathering everyone even if all of you were supposed to be still resting or was about to rest for the day. The man passed his 50s wearing his formal military uniform and was seated at the innermost end of the table. He was Major General Zachariah Faustino, the leading person of this settlement. As for his apology for calling a meeting at this hour, none of the people voiced any dissatisfaction. It was not because everyone here had a good relation with one another, but they had already been used to this routine since the apocalypse came. They needed to address issues that came up as soon as possible or else, the management, was the ones to suffer the backlash. Major General Faustino panned his sight on everyone and continued. This time, our preparations on the incoming entrapment operations had been cancelled. As you all know, we've been preparing to capture the ones behind the hunting of survivors and enslaving them, which happened mostly at the Mariquina Infanta Highway. Yesterday, however, Major Bautista's daughter had been involved with those outlaws by accident and the operation had been moved unreasonably early in order to rescue her. The general turned his eyes at Major Alfonso Bautista, which made the latter lower his head. Unfortunately, not only that our resources and manpower were moved, but we received nothing in return. Not to mention that we also did not manage to get our hands on the leading person of the slave traders alive. This time, the ones at fault are Major Bautista and our hired mercenary here, Jones Galley. But General, I can't be at fault, right? Jones could not help but protest. And why is that? General Faustino turned to Jones with a stern eye. General, I'm not the one who killed or caught Drake, right? I already filed my report. I already saw the report. But why did you not do something to stop that person called Mark? General, don't be unreasonable. Do you think I'll risk my life that way? You already received the report from Major Bautista, right? That group of outlaws were decimated and slaughtered into pieces. I don't want to end up like them. The general's eyes were still skeptical towards Jones' statement, but at least, he accepted the statement a bit. He then turned to Major Bautista. And you, Major, what do you have to say in defense? Nothing, General. I'll accept any punishment. I won't punish you, but please learn your lesson, since it is better for you to work for the settlement than to be detained. Just please, rein in your daughter so that you won't have to move our resources and manpower for personal reasons again. But my daughter is also precious to the settlement, right? Major Alfonso tried to reason. I know that she's a valuable subject to the lab, but if you ask me, she's causing more damage than good. This is the 3rd time this week already, and every time, there would be people injured. This time, it was already lucky that the ones injured were only her teammates. Actually, there are people already voting against letting your daughter remain in this settlement. But General, Major Bautista could not help but raise his voice and stand up hearing the general's previous statement. Major Bautista, you are also a precious asset to this settlement, and that is why we let your troublemaker daughter stay, but the damage that was accumulating because of her was about to exceed your contributions. If more and more people vote to evict her out, even I have no choice but to acquiescence to the desires of the majority. That is why I'm asking you to rein her if you want her to stay. Yes, General. Major Bautista slumped on his chair, obviously depressed. The general sighed as he looked at the expression of his subordinate. He was also a father, and of course, there was no father who would want to get his only living family to get evicted from the settlement. If that happened, for sure, he would also lose a loyal subordinate. General, is that all what you want us to see? To let us watch as you punish your subordinates? The 78-year-old politician at the right side of the table said, which made the other 3 politicians nod in agreement. He was the incumbent governor of Quezon, Daniel Suero. Even in this settlement, the military side and the political side had frictions. No, it's just to address the first matters. The general ignored the snide remark and signaled his secretary to distribute a folder each to everyone. Please open the folders. The general said after the folders were distributed. On the first page is the sketch of the leader of the outlaws that was killed just past this midnight, Eliezer Drake Volkov. The reason why we wanted to catch this person alive was to give a bit of rain against Death Valley Settlement and their people. Eliezer is the first son of the founder and the leading figure of the Death Valley Settlement, Adrik Volkov. Now that his son was dead, we should expect that he'll come for us suspecting that we are the ones that killed his son. As you know, they had eyes and ears everywhere. The news of his son being killed should have reached him by now. But we are not the ones that did it, right? Can't we just hand over the person that did it? One of the politicians with a lean body said with fear in his face. He was Congressman Wilf Everga. It was obvious that he already had confronted the criminals and suffered. The one to contradict the politician, however, was obviously Major Bautista. What are you saying? Are you siding with those beasts to save your own hide? I'm just stating the facts. Those crazy bastards from that crime settlement will do everything to get their hands on what they wanted. I'm sure that they will do a lot of underhanded methods to make us suffer. This is why you politicians are such greedy bastard. A heated argument between Major Bautista and the politicians came about but was immediately stopped by General Faustino. The general glared at the politician as his suggestion was out of military ethics. Although not everything was good in the military, they could not just do it arbitrarily like that. Especially that. Before suggesting something like that, please look at the next page. Everyone turned onto the next page and unexpectedly, there was Mark's detailed sketch on the paper along with the information that was only known in Bay City and the report from Jones and the statements from the other soldiers and Joish who had direct interactions with Mark before. This is the person in question. The person that single-handedly killed over 50 outlaws along with their leader. Among those outlaws, 10 are mutators and more than 30 are evolvers. After the general spoke and let the others read the information, Jones spoke with a sneering face while staring at the politician that suggested to hand Mark over to the criminal settlement. It was obvious that Jones had already read the information in advance. If you want to hand that guy over, you better prepare battalions of soldiers, some tanks and helicopters. Even with those, don't expect that you will be able to catch that guy without dying. While everyone was reading the information, everyone could that read the papers for the first time, even Major Bautista, could not help but widen their eyes. Saving General Perez's daughter and aiding the rescue mission by fighting an unknown even before he became an evolver. Rescuing over 40 survivors in the mall they were trapped in. Eliminating a group of armed escaped convicts just with him with his adoptive daughter and eliminating the leaders and men of 2 underground syndicates with just his 1 or 2 members of his group. Not to mention that he and his group accepted a mission from the military and successfully escorted a group of almost 500 people to Bay City. However, he was gone and missing since then due to the dangerous task he took, and it was to lure away 2 gigantic unknowns away from the people they were escorting. After he was gone missing, his group became one of the pillars in Bay City, and the higher-ups of Bay City was still in the lookout for him even though he was missing for more than 3 weeks already. A person with achievements like this appeared in their settlement and in a grand fashion of annihilating a dangerous group of outlaws, single-handedly and brutally. Not to mention, the information in the paper was already outdated. Along with the report from Jones, it was obvious that the person in question was way stronger than before. Congressman Everga lowered his shaking hands after he read the information and report. It was the same for the other people. They were more inclined to believe that the report was a work of fiction than being real, but unfortunately, it was within the records of Bay City and the report about what happened yesterday and this evening. They would not be able to hand over someone this strong without dying first. This time, one of the military officers spoke. He was Captain Hidalgo Garcia and was one of the officers in charge of security in this settlement. If there is someone this strong, can't we rope him into our side? That is a good suggestion, but how are we going to? The general asked. How about a honey trap? Jones suggested and looked at Major Bautista. Major's daughter is a good candidate. She seemed to have some interests on the guy and the guy don't seem to view her negatively. What are you talking about? Major Bautista stood up once more and shouted. Of course, his daughter being used in this kind of thing would infuriate the father. Chillax, Major. It's a bargain for your daughter, really. Jones waved his hand and the others were intently listening to him. Since she's about to be exiled, if she managed to rope Mark in, then no one will try to evict her anymore. No one would dare try. You get me? Even this old guy here can only listen to you. Jones suddenly pointed his thumb at the general, which was obviously infuriated the old man. He was about to reprimand Jones, but sudden panic knocks on the door interrupted the meeting. Ahem. Come in. General Faustino cleared his throat and answered the knocking. A soldier came in and saluted in a hurried fashion. What's the matter? The soldier looked at Major Bautista first before facing the general and reported. It's Major's daughter, Colleen. She escaped the lab again in her berserk state and is on the loose. 3 scientists and 10 soldiers were injured in her escape. As if orchestrated, General Faustino, the general's secretary, Captain Garcia and even Major Bautista slapped their foreheads with a dismayed expression. Day 36 to 5:37 a.m. Meeting room, Port of Real Settlement Headquarters, Barangay Ungos, Real, Quezon. General, everyone, please excuse me. With a sigh, Major Bautista apologized and stormed out of the meeting room. His daughter getting out of control once more would surely be a bad thing in many ways. He needed to be there to be sure that his daughter would not be hurt or would not hurt more people. Due to the sudden situation, the meeting was adjourned and would be continued later. The politicians left first and then, the secretary, Lieutenant Miller and Captain Garcia also left to help deal with the situation outside. Now, the only ones left in the room were General Faustino and Jones Galley. Jones. General Faustino spoke while rubbing the bridge of his nose. What do you think about that, Mark? Jones tapped his chin several times while looking at the ceiling before he replied. I think he's a good person but mysterious and dangerous at the same time. Depending on how you treat him and the people around him, he can be your best friend or your worst nightmare. There are also a lot of mysterious elements around him like that fairy in those slimes. I don't know if he's a mutator but he's a powerful esper for sure. People like him are dangerous to become an enemy. Not to mention, he don't even react even a bit while killing people. Drake sure died anticlimactically. Your evaluation is very high, don't you think? General, it's not high, it's the truth. Then, what about your honey trap suggestion? How sure are you that it will work? At the latest question of the general, Jones could not help but laugh. Of course, 0. Mark requested to use the transceiver, right? It's very likely that he will return to Bay City sooner or later. However, it seems he had plans in this region so he'll be staying for a while. During that time, maybe we can at least get his help. I see. I also thought the same. The people in Bay City are also looking for him. They even relayed his appearance and information in different settlements here in Luzon. I can understand it though. He saved Miguel's daughter and he vanished before he was able to thank him personally. Still, I'm a bit curious about something. Jones voiced, which made the general turn his head towards him. He's strong and his group seems to be strong too to be able to become one of the pillars in Bay City. I wonder why. Also within the report, they also had a mutator dog and even a huge rhinoceros beetle. Here, he had some strange pets too. If you think more about the things around him, the more mysterious he gets. Hearing Jones' logic, the general could only nod as he looked at the papers on the table. It was unfortunate that the chances of them roping in a very special person were 0 no matter what angle they look at. After entering the settlement, Mark was brought in a room on the 3rd floor of one of the most secure buildings of the military sector. It was a 3-story building newly built by the port. The eastern side of the windows was facing the ocean and the view was good. Still, Mark knew that he was brought here not because he was an important person to them but to be able to maintain surveillance on him. Mark lay on his bed wanting to rest but he was not able to. Unexpectedly, his head was aching too much and he was already sweating due to the pain. Although it was not as painful when his psychic abilities consolidated, it was still painful. The psi crystal on his arm was also shining and shivering at the same time. It indicated that he was undergoing a recovery of his empathic ability. He tried to endure the pain as much as possible in order not to wake Amihan, who was also tired. She was already up for the whole day and almost the whole night. Unlike Mark, who was used to not sleeping even for a day or two, Amihan needed to sleep more. Still, the blood children were awake and aware of Mark's condition. The three surrounded Mark, nudging his body in worry. Compared to Oracle and Crimson, Ivy was having a hard time to move since she was still not trained to hop around like the two. The pain subsided after half an hour and Mark could feel that his empathic ability was now activated. The range was still small, about 5 meters in radius around him, but in the least, he would not need to touch people anymore in order to read their emotions. He could now feel how Amihan was sleeping peacefully on the pillow by the sofa, and he could also feel the two soldiers standing guard just outside his door. Not even 5 minutes passed after the pain subsided when noises came from outside the window. He could hear soldiers shouting about something on the loose and they had to catch. The alarm bell was also sounded. Fortunately, Amihan was not disturbed by the sound of the bell. She was really tired, it seemed. Leaving the comfort of the bed, Mark peeked out of the window facing the other side of port. There he could see the soldiers scrambling to prepare. Then, he saw the reason of the commotion, which surprised Mark a bit. It was in the other 3-story building. Mark was sure that it was the laboratory since he could feel 3 signals of blood children coming from that building. A figure broke through the window of the 3rd floor and jumped down the building. Mark was sure, from her body figure and clothes, the person was Colleen. However, she looked very different. Her eyes were entirely glowing with purple light, while there were a lot of parts of her body covered in a purple-colored armor. Her back long black hair was now purple and was flowing like a possessed person's. Her fingers was also covered in a purple armor that formed claws on her fingers and gauntlets on her hands and wrists. What surprised Mark was because he never detected that Colleen was a mutator and evolvers would never appear and transform like this. There were 2 possibilities Mark could think of why could not detect her consciousness as a mutator. It would be either that she had just turned into a mutator, or it was similar to Freed's existence, another ego. Looking at the practiced formation of the soldiers around the laboratory, it was not the first time that this had happened, which meant that it should be the latter. Since she was obviously a mutator and not a psychic, it was very likely that instead of the savage consciousness birthed by the mutagen devouring Colleen's consciousness, or the other way, both Colleen's original consciousness and the newly born consciousness coexisted in her body. It was a strange and rare case for a mutator. Even stranger, Colleen was surrounded, but she was not attacking primitively at all. Rather, it felt more like she only wanted to escape. Stay here and protect Amihan, all right? Mark caressed the 3 blood children and said. Oracle and Crimson immediately responded with a jiggle, but Ivy was confused about what he said, making the need for him to send his intention through their thought connection. Puff! Mark vanished from the room and a wavy mist flew out of the window. Mark appeared in a location no one could see and approached the commotion. This, Colleen, was rather fierce. Even though she was surrounded by the soldiers, they were not able to catch her. She was even dodging and blocking the tranquilizer darts shot onto her with her claws and armor. Those that tried to catch her personally were sent flying away with her kicks and rolling on the ground in pain. Colleen, stop this and calm down. Mark heard Joash shout, but of course, it was not effective. Colleen was still resisting arrest even though she was already surrounded by 50 soldiers now. She was still trying to jump past the encirclement, but it seemed that the soldiers were already used to her movements. Soon, Major Bautista arrived. His face was filled with dismay after seeing the appearance and behavior of his daughter. Finally, Colleen found an opening to escape, and unexpectedly, she was going towards Mark's direction. The soldiers tried to block her, but her kicks made them fly away to the side, opening the path. The soldiers were surprised to see Mark, who was not familiar to them, on the way of Colleen's escape. Since she was prone to injure anyone who blocked her, The soldiers immediately shouted towards Mark to run away. Both Joash and Major Bautista were also surprised to see Mark among the onlookers. Since he was strong, the two were afraid that he would retaliate once Colleen attacked him. Mark, however, stared at the incoming Colleen. She had already stepped into the domain of his recovered empathic ability, and he could totally read her emotions. To say, her emotions were chaotic. She was afraid, confused, and wanted to escape. She had not a pint of killing intent on her and just pure fear of things. It was as if she did not know anything about her surroundings and could not even understand anything that was happening to her. She was like a child thrown into a world she did not know. Mark could feel traces of Colleen's consciousness, but the one in front of him was totally not Colleen. She was a newly born consciousness that did not belong to this world. When Colleen was just a step away from Mark, she moved. Unexpectedly, she was not attacking, but her gesture was just to shove Mark out of the way while looking at his clothes that was different from the soldiers were wearing. What a kind girl. Although she was confused and afraid, she did not want to hurt anyone innocent. That was what Mark could feel from her. Mark caught the right hand that was about to push him aside with his left. Colleen tried to pull her hand away, but she was not able to. However, instead of attacking Mark, she became more afraid that she was already shivering. Her glowing eyes were not scary at all, but more like pitiful. Since he caught her, Mark extended his free hand towards her. "Please wait, don't hurt her." Major Bautista could not help but scream in fear, but Mark ignored his plea. He was not going to hurt this fascinating creature in the first place. For the first time in a while, a faint milky glow appeared on Mark's hand and eyes as he started to caress the head of the pitiful child. She flinched at first while staring at Mark in fear, but she started to relax once she started to feel the comfortable feeling. Looking at her, Mark could not help but feel the same vibe that the blood children was giving him. They were born after the apocalypse, they were strange and no one was able to understand them. Everything was dangerous for them, and that was why they attack or escape. They did not have a place to belong even in the apocalyptic world. Mark was also the same. He did not belong anywhere, and May was also the same, especially as a supposed to be dead people, and that was why he was making a place for the both of them. Maybe that was also one of the reasons why he felt too close to the blood children. "It's all right. No one will hurt you anymore. I'm here now." Who knows why, but he said those words as he caressed her flowing hair gently. However, time stopped. For the soldiers, Joash and even Major Bautista froze in utter disbelief. Tears flowed slowly from her glowing purple eyes. The wild Colleen, in her berserk state, was crying. She suddenly jumped into Mark's chest and started crying and wailing like a child, pouring all her grievance about everything that happened to her the moment she woke up in this world. Mark was surprised when Colleen in her scary-looking form jumped onto his chest, but he could understand. She was really just a child. No wonder the real Colleen had a very childish quality on her that it almost felt unnatural. She might have been affected by her alter ego born of the mutagen, even if the trait was not present in her subconscious. Still, it was a total mystery to Mark as to why a consciousness born of the mutagen was able to coexist with the original consciousness of Colleen. Mark's sight panned on the laboratory, the soldiers, and towards Major Bautista. The soldiers in this settlement surely knew what was going on. In any case, he wanted to take care of this child. Although the real Colleen was much of a bummer, the child was innocent. Still, it was really off to call her a child though, since she was in a body of a 24-year-old woman. Day 36 to 6:01 a.m. Port of Real Settlement, Barangay Ungos, Real, Quezon. It was very early in the morning and the sun had barely left the horizon, but the military section in the Port of Real Settlement was already bustling with activity. With Colleen losing sanity and breaking out of the laboratory once more in the middle of her laboratory examinations, the alarm was sounded and the soldiers were gathered to catch her. This was not the first time it happened. The current situation had been repeatedly happening since 2 weeks after the outbreak commenced, and this was the third time it happened just this recent week. Every time this happened, there would be people injured and precious property damaged. It was the worst during the first time where 2 scientists and a dozen soldiers were severely injured and the outer wall separating the settlement from the mainland was broken by her. However, even if the damage was done by her, she should not be killed due to her being the daughter of a major and a very important subject of research. The current situation in the port right now, however, was unprecedented. An unfamiliar person stopped Colleen in her mindless rampage and was obviously tamed by him. She was crying like a child on his embrace, even though it more looked like a demon-possessed woman was being appeased by this man. Mark, what? How? It was not only the soldiers in the area were in a stupor, but even the father of the woman in question. He could not even think of what to say or ask correctly in this situation. While everyone was watching the strange and surprising scene, a group of scientists came out of the laboratory and a minute later, several vehicles came into the area. After the people from the vehicle alighted, everyone around saluted to the man in a formal military uniform that came out of the vehicle. General. The soldiers around the vehicles shouted with their salute. What is the situation? Why is everything quiet? Don't tell me that Colleen managed to escape. The general asked with a frown. After all, they received the report of Colleen breaking out of the laboratory once more, but what he saw here was his soldiers standing blankly around something. Sir, it is not what you think. The soldier the general asked replied in a panic. General, look there first. That man is really something, isn't he? Jones tapped the general's shoulder and pointed at a certain direction. The general had a height of an average Filipino, so his view was obstructed by most of the soldiers, but Jones, being a foreigner, had a taller height. He could see more from their position. The general and his entourage waved through the encirclement of the soldiers and onlookers and saw the situation. Of course, he was also surprised to see Mark, who was one of the subjects of their adjourned meeting, and Colleen, who was in her berserk state, on his embrace. General. A scientist in his white lab coat stained with a bit of blood approached the General Faustino. Who is that person? I don't think I saw him here before. That person. General Faustino massaged the bridge of his nose once more. It should have been several times already just in the span of this morning. Let's talk about him later. Do you know what is happening, Professor Suzuki? That's the huge question here, General. Professor Suzuki answered with an exaggerated action of his arms. No one knows what is happening. I already asked the soldiers that were here to catch Colleen. Their answers were clear, but none exactly explains it. We can only ask that man there. Look, even Alfonso is at a loss. This is not the place to talk. Her examinations today are not over yet, right? That is the case, General. All right. General Faustino then turned to Jones and Captain Garcia that came with him. Jones, invite Mark to the lab. Since it looks like she had control over Colleen, we should ask him for cooperation. Garcia, do the cleanup here. If needed, give the injured some of the medicine. Yes, boss. Yes, sir, Jones replied with a lax and lazy manner, while Captain Garcia promptly replied. With the general's order, everyone started to disperse while Jones approached Joish and Major Bautista, who was in front of Mark and Colleen. It looked like there was also a situation between the four, since Colleen was hiding behind Mark like a scared child from her concerned father and friend. Just who was Colleen's real family here and friends here? Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Being invited to meet with the general and get a tour of the military laboratory, Mark really had no reason to refuse. Rather, it was one of the things he wanted to do the most this time. At the entrance of the laboratory building, Mark was met with an old man wearing his formal military uniform, who was unnecessarily surrounded by armed soldiers and a number of white-coated scientists. Since the old man's insignia was open for him to see, Mark knew that he should be the general in charge of this settlement. I'm Zachariah Faustino, the officer in charge of this settlement. Mark, right? I heard a lot about you. General Faustino extended his right hand for a handshake, which obviously made Mark troubled. Not only that he hated this custom due to various reasons, he was also holding Colleen's hand right now. Since this Colleen was afraid of everyone and obviously did not want to enter the laboratory, Mark had to hold her hand to make her feel secure. Once he did so, however, her hand was clamped on his and did not want to let go. She even retracted the claw-shaped armors on her fingers so she would not hurt Mark's hand. More than that, she was even stronger than Mark physically. Just pulling his hand away would be impossible. Seeing the situation, the people around had strange expressions on their faces. On the other hand, the general read the situation and retracted his right hand and extended the other. Without any other choice, Mark accepted the handshake and asked, "What do you mean by hearing a lot about me?" The general nodded in understanding and replied, "Let's talk as we enter the laboratory." With the general in the lead and Mark and Colleen walking beside him, they entered the building while being surrounded by the soldiers. Of course, these soldiers was not only here to escort them. Mark could tell that they were on guard against him. Among the people, Jones and Joish were also present. It seemed that the status of Joish was also not low within this settlement. Mark thought that they would need to wear some protective suits as they entered the laboratory, but it did not seem to be the case. As long as they only stayed within the main corridors and some specific areas, it was fine with their current attire. They only needed to wear protective suits and lab gears when entering testing and experimentation areas, especially the ones that handles genetic samples and chemicals. About Mark's question, the general answered it. He was surprised that Bay City actually sent out a notice to every settlement to have an eye to look out for him. Inside the laboratory, rooms after rooms separated the parts of the building. The outer windows had been sealed while the interior of the rooms could be seen through a window from accessible in the hallway. On the first floor, the laboratory handled the evolved and strange animals they captured in the wild and at the sea. These animals appeared after the outbreak. Some animals looked like a mutated variant of animals before the outbreak, while some were totally new species. This reminded Mark of the wolf-like fox Nicole brought back as her pet. By the way, what happened to her? Mark took the opportunity to ask about Colleen. Hearing the question, General Faustino turned his head first towards Major Bautista. Seeing that the latter nodded in consent, the general narrated Colleen's circumstances and introduced the professor and head scientist in the lab, Masaki Suzuki, in the process. It all started with the fact that the soldiers that established this settlement came from Metro Manila and not from any closer areas. They were only designated in this area after the emergency measures were taken. Back in Metro Manila, Major Bautista lost his wife and son, Colleen's mother and older brother, in the initial burst of the outbreak. It was because their home was near one of the ground zeros. Even with that fact, the poor major still proceeded to perform his duties. Fortunately, Colleen was out of the city that time and was around here in Quezon to shoot a drama series. Yes, unexpectedly, Colleen was a popular rising actress. Mark had no idea at all since he was more interested in Japanese actors and actresses than local ones. The TV in his home was not even used for more than 2 years before the outbreak. In order to find Colleen, Major Bautista requested to be designated in this settlement, which was approved with the help of General Faustino and Professor Suzuki, who was actually a close friend of the major. Luckily, he found Colleen safe and sound. Although she was found stranded and surrounded by the infected, the military made it before it was late. Unexpectedly, 4 people among the drama crew became evolvers on the first few days of the outbreak, and they were Colleen and her 3 friends, which were also actors and actresses in the drama crew. They established a group that helped in a lot of things in the settlement. Unfortunately, Colleen was involved in a breach that happened while the wall at the south of the settlement was being built. In order to save a child from a mutated infected, Colleen fought the infected. She managed to save the child and killed the infected, but in exchange, she was bitten. She was turning, and since she was the only family left of Major Bautista, he did not want to lose her. Not to mention that the breach caused a dozen of soldiers to be bitten by the infected. They resorted to drastic measures, human experimentation. It was unethical in the field of medicine, but they had no choice. Since it was found out early that the unstable strain of mutagen alters the people bitten genetically, they focused on the genetic experimentation of the victims of the breach. Cutting the genetic strands, altering the genes, and even planting a foreign gene on their genetic makeup, they conducted different methods and even methods that had never been tested before to each of the victims. Both fortunately and unfortunately, only Colleen survived the experimentation. As for the other subjects, it was already lucky if they died. Most of them turned into hideous monsters that needed to be put down for the greater good. However, Colleen's case was not a total success either. Her personality drastically changed that she almost felt like a different person. Not to mention that she had episodes where she transforms and loses control of herself like what happened earlier. At this point, everyone glanced at Colleen, who was silently and timidly walking beside Mark while tightly holding his hand. Although she was still armored, her purple hair was still waving as if unaffected by gravity and her eyes glowing with purple light. The fierce expression she had as she tried to escape every time was nowhere to be found. All this was done by the person in front of them right now. All of them were curious as to how he did it, but no one dared to voice it. The general had already instructed them not to say anything and try to offend Mark. While everyone was thinking that, Mark suddenly stopped in front of the window of a room which enclosed a certain animal in a cage. It looked like a hybrid of a snake and a lizard while having the size of an adult alligator. Its head looked like a snake's and it had a longer neck than normal proportions while its body was shaped like a monitor lizard. The scales of the lizard were like large stones embedded on its body. Seeing the animal, it though hit Mark's mind as he remembered the ability he acquired from the boss of the outlaws. I want to make a dragon. I want a dragon mount. His eyes shone with desire. Day 36 to 6:28 a.m. Military Laboratory, first floor, Port of Real Settlement, Barangay Ungos, Real, Quezon. Mark. Is something wrong? General Faustino could not help but ask since Mark suddenly stopped in front of the window. Even though a strange thought suddenly sprouted in Mark's mind as he saw the strange lizard, he was not spaced out and was aware of what was happening in his surroundings. He turned to the general and asked, "So, what is the reason for you to invite me to this place? I doubt that it's just for a tour, right?" As Mark went straight to the point, General Faustino nodded to Professor Suzuki. The professor stepped forward and stated the situation. It is about Colleen. As you can see, her abilities differed during her normal and berserk states. We already managed to do physical and psychological tests on her when she's normal, and we already did medical tests during her berserk state when we managed to calm her down with tranquilizers. However, as she always managed to break out in her berserk state and would not cooperate, we could not conduct the other tests we wanted to do. Since seemed to be able to calm her and communicate with her, we want you to help with the tests. As you see, we still needed to do the tests as to why she loses control and awareness of herself, so we also wanted to do some psychological tests. I see. Mark had already expected this when he saw the effort the military did to catch her. However, their foresight on her situation was totally wrong. She was not going berserk or losing control of herself. The one before them was a totally different consciousness from the original. Of course, Mark had no reason to tell them what he knew. What he needed to do was to make the most of the situation. Besides, if the tests were not harmful to Colleen, she most likely would not try to escape since he was here. Mark looked at the scientist and back to General Faustino. What can I get for cooperating on this? At that question, the general became troubled and murmurs came from the people around them. Normally, we can give out weapons and supplies, but I don't think that you have any need for those. That was true. The military had firearms and supplies, but Mark had no use for those. He could find supplies on his own with his abilities. The firearms, on the other hand, had stronger firepower but were just consumables. Firearms needed bullets, and it would be troublesome to go back and forth to military settlements to trade for ammunition since they were the only ones that could provide them. Not to mention that most firearms were loud and would draw a lot of attention in many ways. Mark preferred his crossbows and needle launchers more. I have a proposition then. Mark interrupted the murmurs of the people around and took their attention. Give me the 3 slimes you have here in your laboratory. The scientists and the general became wide-eyed at his proposition. Most of the things inside the laboratory were top secret, and the slimes were one of those since they were creatures that had their existences very close to absurdity. The slimes were living creatures despite the fact that their bodies were only composed of blood. There should have been no way for Mark to know the exact number of the slimes in their laboratory. I don't know how you knew the exact number of what we had here, but I don't think that we can agree to that. That was what the general said, but Professor Suzuki seemed to have a different thought. General, wait a second. Don't disagree too fast, Professor Suzuki said and turned to Mark. I heard that you have two and found another 1 hour ago. I'm very interested of how you managed to tame them, and I also want to know the reason why you requested those out of all things. Actually, I won't be surprised if you asked for that lizard there. Mark looked straight at Professor Suzuki. As expected of a scientist, he was more interested in the information and data than immediately declining the proposition. It also showed that this person was very observant and saw Mark's reaction when he saw the lizard inside the room. You already said it. I have 3 with me. You can say that they have a connection to me, and that is why I can tame them. In any case, the method can't be replicated by just anybody. Besides, I'm sure that you all have no use to them at all aside from keeping them as specimen, am I right? Mark then panned his eyes to everyone. I'll be frank. Aside from asking to use the transceiver and finding a vehicle which I already had, one of the reasons I'm here is to retrieve those 3. Even if you all wanted it or not, I'll take them back. I don't think that any one of you can stop me. It was a frank and blatant threat, but they could not deny it. With Mark's prowess, none of them would be able to stop him from taking them. Professor Suzuki shrugged his shoulders with a bitter smile and turned to General Faustino. It seemed that there would be no way for them to get the information they wanted from Mark easily. Just agree to it, General. Are you sure? Actually, we're already done with all the tests and experiments we can do with those 3. There is no need to dissect them either, since the insides of their bodies were plain to see. If we can move our stagnated research with Colleen, giving out those 3 is already a bargain. Even I can't see any advantage into keeping those 3. In every day that passed, those 3 are growing weaker. It won't be long before those 3 died. With the consent from the head scientist, the general also agreed. Mark also found this scientist in front of him as someone interesting. Mark was brought into a wide room at the 2nd floor of the laboratory. Here, the tests necessary to be done by Colleen was conducted with his help. Amazingly, Colleen obeyed Mark's instructions as long as he patiently explained to her what she needed to do. It was quite of a slow process because of the communication barrier, but the tests were done in several hours. During the physical tests, Colleen in her transformed form even surprised Mark. Although she was lacking in move speed, her physical strength and reflexes were top-notch and several times higher than normal humans. According to Professor Suzuki, she even had the highest physical evaluation compared to all the mutators in the settlement they had tested before. In the middle of the tests, Mark had a sudden intermission when he felt that Oracle and Crimson was calling onto him. As Colleen would not behave without Mark, he brought her along and vanished in a puff of black mist that surprised everyone that had not seen it before. They were afraid that Mark would take Colleen away, but Jones and Professor Suzuki knew that he would not run away. After all, the 3 slimes were not handed to him yet. About 5 minutes later, Mark returned inside the laboratory with Colleen. This time, however, he had a sulking fairy on his shoulder and he had his bag on. The eyes of the scientists shone, seeing a creature of fairy tales in front of them, but of course, Mark would not let them touch a Mihan in any way. While Colleen undergone the next set of tests, Mark requested the 3 blood children to be brought to him, which was immediately granted. The 3 blood children given to him were surely in good condition and were encased in clean aquariums. Still, they were weak. This was one of the problems why most blood children died. It was not only because they had no way to find food on their own, and they had a very inefficient way of consuming blood. Even Crimson, that he found first in the river, was only able to recover after being changed by Mark's blood. Poor children. That was what Mark thought when he saw the blood children in their aquariums shrink back in fear when he extended his hands on them. They even attacked by extending tentacles on his hand, but Mark was not afraid of it. Since there were people around, he stealthily extended a blood whip on his palm and secretly turned the blood children when no one was looking. He also gave the three a bit more of his blood to help them recover a little. Everyone around were all watching the test Colleen was doing as she slashed her claws on different materials prepared. When they turned back to Mark, they were all surprised when they saw 5 slimes playing on the table in front of him while one was clinging to his arm. Mark had brought Oracle, Crimson and Ivy inside his bag, but the three were all excited about the existence of their new brothers and sister. The new blood children were still shy as this was a new experience for them, but they looked better with their deep red color like what Crimson had. Oracle and Crimson were bouncing around the three, extending tentacles on the three as if patting their heads to assure them. The two was obviously copying what Mark was doing to them when he patted their jelly-like bodies. Ivy, on the other hand, was just clinging onto Mark's arm while paying attention to the situation on the table. A deep sense of curiosity could be detected from Professor Suzuki when he saw the changes on the blood children, especially when he saw Oracle and Ivy that had a very different color than the others. However, it was out of question. These children belonged to Mark now, and there was no way that he would return them. When Colleen returned from the test, where she ran towards Mark as if escaping from the scientists, Mark gave her a pat on her head, which she seemed to like a lot. On the side, however, both Joash and Major Bautista had complicated expressions on their faces. They both felt like they were being neglected here. However, the two could not do anything. While Colleen was in this form, she could not recognize the two. As for turning back to normal, it would happen eventually, as it had always been. It had been like this since she became like this. Colleen seemed to be interested at the blood children on the table, but it seemed that her existence overpowered the three new ones and they shrunk back in fear. On the other hand, Colleen also had a trace of fear on her despite her interest. "We're done for now." Professor Suzuki approached Mark and said. His eyes were glued at the blood children, though. "Shouldn't you finish all the tests already?" Mark asked, but his question was met with a shake of the professor's head. "Look at her eyes. The glow is already starting to disappear. It's an indication that she's about to return to normal." Mark looked at her eye and saw that the glow was really lesser than before. "She can't control this transformation, right?" "Unfortunately, yes. This only happens randomly, and who knows when she will break out again." While Mark and Professor Suzuki were talking, the emergency alarm of the settlement sounded. The sound was different to the alarm used when Colleen broke out of the laboratory. "Another attack, huh? This should be the infected again. It's a pity they came late. I wanted to test and see how Colleen would cope with fighting the infected." Professor Suzuki looked at Colleen, who was grasping Mark's hand once more. The glow on her eyes was growing dimmer and dimmer. Hearing what the professor said, Mark also became interested. Sure enough, this Colleen could fight. However, she only used her kicks before when she tried to escape, and never her claws and other abilities. Mark's eyes and right hand suddenly glowed with milky white light as he tried to enforce this Colleen's consciousness like how he did with mutators he helped before. Luckily, it was successful. Her purple eyes glowed brighter, which made the professor taken aback. The professor could not help but turn to Mark as his interest in the latter grew. He was really an arsenal of mysteries. Mark, on the other hand, turned to Colleen. "Colleen, no, let's just call you Carla. Want to play a bit? We have playmates outside." Day 36 to 10:32 a.m. Port of Real Settlement, Barangay Ungos, Real, Quezon. Carla, Carla, Carla. The other consciousness of Colleen, born of the experimentation done to her, Carla, muttered the name Mark gave her over and over while giggling creepily. Her voice was a little gruff sounding, with 2 different voice pitches echoing like how possessed people in movies sounded when speaking. Her creepy voice, however, did not hide her childish demeanor as she happily accepted the name given to her. Right now, Carla sat at the right side of the backseat of a Humvee together with Mark, while Joash drove the vehicle and Major Bautista sat on the front passenger seat. This should be the first time for Carla to ride a vehicle, but she did not seem to care about it and was more focused on remembering her name. This behavior gained the confusion of the two on the front seats, since she was obviously Colleen, but in what reason would she accept another name? Since the alarm sounded and with Mark enforcing the consciousness of Carla, it gave them the chance to see how Carla would behave and fight against the infected. It was actually easier if they would just bring an infected from outside. However, they would not do anything like that in this settlement since they focused mainly on fauna of the area. Furthermore, bringing an infected inside the lab would result in unusual behavior among the evolved animals contained in the laboratory. It was as if they could sense the infected and wanted to eat them. However, since continuously eating the bodies of the infected had some effects on the animals on the long run, they would not try such experiments, at least, not in the near future. They were currently in a convoy composed of military vehicles that boarded the general and his entourage and the scientists that would observe the session. Still, the scientists would not go on the field but would use camera-mounted drones to record Carla's fight. Of course, since there was also the possibility of Mark fighting, they also wanted to capture his abilities on video. "My lord, what's wrong with her?" Emihan asked as she peeked on the other side of the vehicle. Carla had her head lowered as if chanting her name in a prayer. "Just ignore her. She's just happy about her name." Emihan was confused. She knew that the woman's name was Colleen and it was the first time she saw a transformed mutator up close. Although Mark had already told her the situation, she could not help but feel curious. After all, she noticed that even though she was obviously human, she did not feel like one either. While being curious about many things, along with this being the first time she was able to ride a car, she was turning her head everywhere. It was then when she noticed the expressions of the people by the side of the road as they hurried to go back to their dwellings. To say, the people's expressions looked the same when they, the spirit races, were driven away from the human society. Mark could sense Amihan's emotions as she looked at the people outside. He caressed her head with his finger. "Don't look outside." Yes. Mark was not fond of these people at all. These people were those that chose to stay in the safe confines behind the settlement walls and live on their fear of the outbreak. Although most of them were just normal people, it was not an excuse to rely on others to protect them while they hid inside their homes cowering in fear. Sure enough, this was the bad qualities of humans. The convoy reached the walls after more than 5 minutes after leaving the laboratory. The atmosphere was surprisingly dark even for the soldiers. "General." The soldiers on top of the 5-meter wall saluted as the general and his entourage along with Mark, Carla and the scientists went up the stairs. "I need the report," General Faustino said, which the soldiers hurriedly replied. "Yes, sir." While the scientists prepared their equipment, the soldiers on site gave their report. Apparently the situation was not the usual infected attack they experienced before, and the general, the other officers and soldiers could not help but frown hearing the state of the situation. A horde of more than 4,000 infected along with innumerable mutated ones was spotted by scouts on the southern coast about 3 kilometers away from the settlement. This number was very unusual in these parts of the country where the population even before the outbreak was way lower. The horde was moving along the main roads from the south and was speculated to be an accumulated amount of infected from several areas in the south. Due to this behavior, the scouts speculated that there would be several leader types among the horde. Mark, who also heard the report, could not help but think that it was the same with the wave of infected they encountered before. Since the accumulation of the survivors in the other areas was low, these infected followed the coastline to search for prey. Due to the fact that the infected would likely not be interested in the ocean or the mountains, it led the infected towards this settlement. What a strange time for this to happen when he was here. It seemed that the military already gave these infected different classifications depending on their abilities. Mark started to inquire about these classifications and could not help commend the military on how easy to understand the characteristics of the infected using the infected classifications they had. They only have about 2 hours to prepare, probably, even less. It was already what the soldiers could stretch out even if there were squads on the field already hindering the horde using blockades and traps. The soldiers also prepared a few lines of defense outside the walls. After all, the walls should be the last line of defense they had against the infected. Once the walls were breached and they were not able to contain the breach, it would be the end for the settlement. Soon, The sounds of gunshots from the field squads could already be heard along with the appearance of the vehicles that contained the injured soldiers. It did not take long and the retreating squads came back and the first groups of infected was on site. Grr. Mark had to hold Carla's hand tightly this time. As a consciousness similar to a failed mutator, it seemed that she had adverse reactions towards the infected. Her expression this time, Mark had seen it before. It was the same expression the stone-clad woman had when she fought with the frog-headed mutated infected. It contained disgust and hate even though their origins were the same. Since the situation was kind of unusual, Major Bautista and Joish wanted to cancel the scheduled experiment. It was also supported by the other scientists. On the other hand, Carla would not agree to it. She was already on complete battle mode. If not for Mark holding her back, she would have jumped off the wall already to join the fight. It did not take long and the mutated infected started to appear. It was a hybrid infected that had qualities of both armored types and agility types. It was impervious to bullets that the soldiers even needed to use a rocket to kill it. "All right, time to go," Mark said, making Professor Suzuki nod. "Are you sure that it will be fine?" Major Bautista asked with worry of his face. "Don't worry about it. When it comes to worst, I can take her away and escape." "All right. I'll leave my daughter in your hands." Mark nodded and the two of them vanished in a puff of black mist. Although they had already seen this before, it was still a surprising sight, not to mention to the soldiers on top of the wall that saw it for the first time that could not help but step back in surprise. Together with Carla and Amihan, Mark appeared at the base of the wall. He did it at the very back of the line of defense so that the soldiers defending the wall would not be surprised. Although they had been informed about Mark and Carla, it was still not good to suddenly appear near them. Seeing that the drones were launched from above, Mark dragged Carla to the side so that she would not disturb the soldiers and mutators on their work. Carla was eager to go and immediately ran towards the closest infected she could see after Mark let her go. Brandishing her claws, she swiped towards the infected. Even though her movement speed was on the lower side, her attack speed was not. With an attack that only afterimages could be seen, the head of the infected was divided into several slices. Without stopping, she lunged towards the next one and lopped the infected's head off. Wild and fierce, that was how she fought the large number of infected that started to attack her. The swings of her arms were rather wide and inefficient in normal cases of attack, but her attack speed and inhuman strength made up for that inefficiency. While the drones were recording and Mark watched by the side, the soldiers that were supposed to assist Mark and Carla finally arrived. Since Mark had just vanished from the top of the wall and appeared below, they were late. They wanted to complain but of course they could not and just went on their duties. "Watch out!" Several soldiers from the defensive line shouted towards the soldiers around Carla. It was because an infected about 3 meters tall was coming towards the direction of the experiment. The skin of the infected was gray in color and was covered in rough and bulky rock-like matter. It was running rather fast, which totally contradicted its body size and shape. For sure it was a hybrid of armor type and agility type infected. Even though the infected was coming towards the area of the experiment, it was surely not coming for Carla or the soldiers around them. Mark was sure it was coming for him. The soldiers were shooting the infected but their bullets just bounced off the infected's armor. It was very impervious to bullets. Unfortunately, it was already too close to the defensive line and a rocket was impossible to use at this range. Mark was about to move when he noticed a sudden change with Carla. Her hair that was unaffected by gravity started swaying fiercely and the glow on her eyes intensified. Following that, the blades on her claws grew longer, started to emit a faint violet glow. She pounced towards the incoming hybrid infected, which scared out the wits of the soldiers guarding her along with the people on top of the wall observing the situation. In their previous test on how strong Carla's claws were, she was not able to cut through a thick steel pole. Even a steel pole would not be able to bounce off all the bullets that hit it and would get embedded on it, which meant that the gray armor of the infected was way thicker and stronger. However, their worries were for nothing. The glow on the claws on Carla's both hands left behind a glowing afterimage as she swiped the claws on the hybrid infected in a shape of an X. The hybrid infected suddenly stopped moving and its whole body crumbled into pieces. Everyone was surprised since she managed to cut the infected's body into pieces, but Mark had a different reason. Most people could not follow her attack speed, but Mark could, and to say, he saw the process Carla cut the body of the infected. Her glowing claws did not cut just into the material of the infected's armor. Even a clean cut would have a bit of friction on the attack and would also cause a slight sound of the material being cut. Carla's attack, however, had none of those. In what Mark saw, her attack was able to cut through the substance itself. She was cutting through matter without hindrance. It almost felt like her attack changed the shape of the enemy's body. Mark immediately had several theories considering what he saw. It could be either she was able to separate the molecules of the substance or she was able to destroy the bond of the molecular makeup of the matter. Either way, it was a very frightening ability. If Mark was right, there was nothing that Carla would not be able to cut with her glowing claws, or in the least, there was very few that she would not be able to cut. He wanted to know more about her ability, and he still have a lot of chances to see it. After all, the horde of mutated infected had just started to arrive. Day 36 to 12:34 p.m. First defense line, Barangay Ungos, Real, Quezon. The battle between the soldiers started to get more and more intense. The main forces of the infected finally arrived, putting more pressure on the soldiers and mutators that were participating on the defense. In terms of quantity, the forces of the settlement were totally outnumbered against the horde of infected. In the settlement, the total population was around 7,000 people. Among that large number, only around 2,000 were the soldiers, and the mutators and evolvers numbered around 500. The remaining population, however, and the majority were the non-combatants. Although this part of the population was mostly composed of the normal populace, it also included a portion of the government officials and the scientists. In the true sense, this attack right now was a very threatening one. A single slip-up could end up severely endangering the whole settlement. Due to that, 80% of the settlement's forces were deployed while the remaining percentage was sent to prepare for emergency measures. A plethora of deafening sounds echoed in the battlefield as the forces of the settlement tried their best to resist the incoming infected. On the background, explosions could be seen as grenades, rockets, landmines, and even vehicles exploded in the middle of the horde. Unfortunately, although those explosions damaged and killed a lot of infected, the number was still negligible. Not to mention that unlike injured humans that would stop after being wounded, the infected would not, even if their wounds were supposed to be fatal. Despite their injuries and those who even had their intestines dangling out of their abdomen, the infected would still press forward as long as their heads and necks were intact. At the area of the experiment, the battle also intensified. Although Carla was still able to hold her ground, the soldiers that were assisting the experiment no longer had any choice but to join the defense line. "Sir Mark, please take this." A soldier from the top of the wall came out of the gates and handed a wireless lapel and earphone to Mark. "You guys should have given me this earlier," Mark said with a side glance. "Please, inquire the details after wearing it. I have to return to my post." The soldier saluted to Mark and retreated back into the gate. While Mark finished wearing the lapel, he saw the same soldier on top of the wall behind a mounted gun firing at the infected at the distance. Mark, can you hear me?" As Mark turned on the lapel, he heard a voice. Without mistake, the voice belonged to General Faustino. "I can hear you clearly. You guys should have given me this earlier. I apologize, but we plan to do the test in a short period and there should have been no need for this. However, maybe, you can't see the situation in your position, but the front line is in a bad situation. And what do you want me to do? Don't expect me to be able to kill all these infected. In any case, won't work for free either." Mark could hear a groan on the other side. The general should be rubbing his temples right now. "General, please let me." Another voice could be heard. "Mark, this is Professor Suzuki. Can we do the negotiations later? As we can see here, you're just watching behind. Can you please join the defense? In any case, we will calculate the compensation depending on your contribution." It is the same with the other non-military forces. Hearing that, Mark shrugged his shoulder. Just say it frankly. You just want to see me fight, right? Also, telling me that information at this point. You people just want me to contribute to the battle as much as possible. I'll tell you, you guys won't be able to pay me if I contribute as much as I can. The other side became silent. It seemed that they were discussing something since Mark could hear faint murmurs away from the microphone. Soon, General Faustino spoke once more. Well, then. Please do what you can. In any case, if the situation continues, we might be able to defend the settlement, but the sacrifices will be massive. We used a drone to observe the horde and we saw a group of strange infected among the horde. If those infected arrive, we expect the front lines to crumble. Unfortunately, we can't shrink the defense towards the wall. And the experiment? I'm sure you can't handle Carla at all. It shouldn't be a problem right now. Although we are also surprised. Colleen can handle her ground. Also, compared to other positions, the infected in running towards the area is minimal. With our soldiers assisting her, she should be fine. In any case, her father and friend together with our other soldiers will come to assist her. All right. I'll handle the group you are talking about. Mark decided to help. In any case, he would milk this settlement as much as he could. Due to Mark's decision, the people on top of the wall sighed because of various reasons. First, they had been anticipating Mark to participate from the start and see his strength, since among the people here, only Jones had seen it. Although a lot had been stated on papers, there was still skepticism with their minds. It would only be cleared if they witnessed it before their eyes, or they would not be able to rest. Another reason was how Mark voiced his decision. Even though it was just through the lapel, his reply lacked the hesitation and fear of jumping in the middle of the horde. Normal and unconfident people would not be able to do that at all. Carla. Mark called out, but she did not respond. He then turned to Emihan on his shoulder. Emihan, stay here and help Carla if she's in trouble. I'll trust you for her safety, but if it becomes dangerous, escape first, all right? Emihan turned to Mark and towards Carla, who was still wildly decimating every infected that came her direction. Hearing the word trust, her expression became resolute as she nodded. Don't worry, my lord. You can count on me. I'll blow away any dangerous enemy towards the other people there. Mark looked at Emihan with a strange expression. She was pointing at the soldiers fighting on the other side. However, what she said was not wrong either. That was the only kind of protection she could give out, since there was no way for her to kill the infected even with her wind control. This thought gave Mark a sudden idea. Maybe he could try and teach this Lil Sylph if she would be able to do some attacks with her wind control ability. Similar to the ones used in RPGs, Windblades, and the like. After Emihan flew off from his shoulder, he vanished in a puff of black mist. With several appearances and disappearances, he finally arrived on a roof of a two-story house in the middle of the battlefield. This house was literally in the middle of the horde, about 200 meters away from the wall of the settlement. Even though he was in the middle of the horde, Mark could not feel anything at all. It was a perk of being a mutator, and this way, he was able to concentrate on his fights, since he would not panic even if he wanted to. He would not get scared either, no matter what. Ignoring the horde below and the drones that were hurrying to chase after him, Mark started to prepare. This time, he wore the pair of gauntlets, Attacker and Defender, but he rotated the bracer, placing the needle case on the back and the needle launcher under his wrist. Using his blood whips, he activated a mechanism on the Defier on his back, and the outer layers of the shield separated into two parts before the two parts detached from the centerpiece and the inner layers. Leaving the centerpiece and inner layers on his back, Mark attached the two parts of the shield on the backside of both his gauntlets while he held the Slicer and Divider whip swords on both hands. With the two parts of the shield on his both arms, he could defend himself just by putting his arms together, while the swords on his hands would do the offensive. Since he was going in the middle of the horde this time, he took another precaution. His blood whips seeped from his neck and onto his face before it formed a mask and metallized. And for just a bit of style, the remaining blood whips formed several loose metal threads and turned into something like a short metallic scarf. Mark looked above, and the drones had already had him on the camera. Although he hated being captured in pictures and videos, it could not be helped this time. It was also one of the reasons he made a mask to conceal his face. "Since you guys wanted to see me fight, then watch," he murmured with a glint in his eyes. Looking around the vicinity, he saw his first target, a mutated infected that was behaving oddly. It had a lean body and sharp claws. Unlike other infected that was charging towards the defensive line of the settlement, it was lurking behind buildings and blending with the normal biters and eaters was it closed unto the soldiers. He chose this target not because it stood out on his view but because he could feel the psi crystal on his arm vibrating as he stared on the infected. This should be the predator type, they said. He thought as it reminded him of the infected with claw arms that attacked his base before. Looking like a certain ninja from a mobile game, he vanished in the mist and waved through the air before appearing behind the predator type infected. The mutated infected seemed to have noticed the use of his psychic ability and tried to turn around. However, it was already late. A blade was already hacking towards its head. As he appeared, Mark swung the divider from above, which totally split the infected's head into two. Since the infected tried to turn towards him, the face of the infected was totally removed from its head and fell first before its body did. The black pebble flew out of its head, which Mark hurriedly grabbed and hid from the drone above. It was a quick kill, but his appearance halted the advance of the infected in the area. All the infected that saw Mark growled fiercely as they all turned away from the initial direction of their charge. Instead, they all ran towards Mark as if they all agreed to swarm him. Ignoring the seemingly dangerous situation he was in, Mark rotated the blades on his hands and held the blades in a reverse grip. With a flick of his blood whip, the connected blades turned into whip blades before he swung the blades on the incoming infected. The first ones to run towards Mark stopped on their tracks as their heads fell on the ground. Avoiding the blood that spurted out of the infected's necks, Mark jumped towards the nearest wall and propelled himself upwards before kicking the wall. Mark spun his body and hacked at the infected that jumped at him at the same time. Obviously, this one was another mutated infected, which should be an agility type, as it was able to jump over the other infected in order to attack. The two blades hacked the arms and the neck of the mutated infected and fell from its lunge. Mark then landed his foot on another infected, smashing its teeth in the process. He then kicked downwards, which broke the infected's neck before he vanished from the sight of the infected charging towards him. Mark then appeared elsewhere, hacking towards another mutated infected with strange features. While he fought in this area, his main target finally arrived. As the general said, it was a strange group of mutated infected. Unlike the others, these mutated infected always moved together. Not only that, but each of the infected looked strong. Seeing this group, Mark started to wonder what the catch with these guys was. Day 36 to 12:42 p.m. Settlement defensive wall, port of Real Settlement, Barangay Ungos, Real, Quezon. At the time Mark vanished from the experiment site, General Faustino atop the wall could not help but shake his head. Even if Mark was a strong individual according to the reports he received, it seemed that he was an impatient person. For the second time, he left without waiting for the assistance to arrive. Furthermore, with him vanishing like that, it would be hard for them to use the drones and capture his abilities on camera. On the back of the platform, the scientists and personnel controlling the drones and monitoring the video feed were frantically searching for Mark. Where is he? Quick, search around. He's not by the main road. He is not at the western side either. Those kinds of conversation could be heard among them. There, found him. One of the monitoring personnel shouted after seeing Mark appear above the room using the zoomed camera of the drone he was controlling. Even though Mark was not really part of the experiment, the general ordered them to monitor his movements. After all, it was not good to know nothing but the things in the written report. They needed to see his exact abilities. Even though they did not have any ill motives, having someone strong like him around and not under control could become dangerous even if he was not hostile to the settlement. That ability is really something, Professor Suzuki said as he viewed one of the videos that caught Mark's disappearance. Have you discovered something? General Faustino made his way towards his side and asked while also peering at the monitor. I'm not really an expert in this field, but I can say that his vanishing ability is not an ability a mutator can have, or at least, not an ability that a mutator can use without transforming first. Professor Suzuki rewound the video and paused at the scene at the exact time Mark turned into mist and vanished. Look at this. The professor pointed at the effect where Mark was enveloped in black mist. There is a blur at this part behind him while he turned into that mist. I can't say for sure, but it looked like a tear in space fabric. At first, I thought his ability is something like teleportation, but I guess it's more like a warp ability. Furthermore, there is a trail of mist here as he moves. To me, it's not just a special effect but a residue effect of him tearing through space while traveling through a portal or a subspace. I wish I can study his ability more, but what we can analyze with just these videos is limited. Professor Suzuki then played the video once more in slow motion and continued. Traveling through a space tear or a subspace should not be possible for a human body to do. A human body will not be able to withstand it. There is a possibility for transformed mutators since during their transformation, their cells, genetic makeup and even constitution changes to something that deviated from the theories of science severely. Although we don't have one around, there might be a mutator that can travel through a tear in space after transforming. Mark, however, did not transform at all. It was as if there is a certain invisible energy around his body negating the side effects of traversing space in nothing but pure human flesh. Then, Professor, is what Jones said about his ability true? I really can't say for sure, but the possibility is very high, since it is not a mutator ability. This Mark is very likely to be one of those rare people with superhuman psychic abilities, an Esper. While the speculations about him was being discussed atop the wall, Mark was already observing the strange group of infected in the middle of the horde. Even more strange was that the group was not moving like the other infected that was blindly charging towards the defense line. It was as if they were observing the situation first. It was a very strange behavior for the infected. Mark counted the number while hiding on one of the roofs. The group was not very large. They only consisted of 30 mutated infected, but each of them looked nothing that could be compared to normal infected. The outer line of the group was composed with infected that had armors, bulky bodies and were even larger than a tank. The inner parts of the group were composed if infected with various appearances, and for sure, these mutated were different types. Boom! A stray rocket flew near the group. Unexpectedly, the armor types in front immediately moved to try and block the rocket. Unfortunately, the rocket did not reach the group but fell about a dozen meters before them. Still, the armor types stood their ground and caught the full brunt of the impact from the explosion. They are protecting something, Mark said, and immediately searched the inner parts of the group for an infected that would stand out, or even the centermost of the group, but did not find one. There did not seem to be a leader among the group either, which made Mark confused. Of course, there were leader types among these infected, but what Mark was searching was the true leader of this whole horde. Since he could not find what he was looking for, the only thing he could do was fight. Mark vanished from his position, appeared several meters above the group. Mark smiled. There were infected among the group that noticed him appear, but they all could not see him clearly as the sun was literally above Mark. While the infected were blinded by the sun, Mark vanished once more and appeared already charging downwards with both his swords hacking down. His body spun mid-air as he slashed down, aiming for mutated infected with a lean body. With the same strategy as multiplayer online battle arena games, he aimed first at the ones that should be easy to kill but dangerous to leave for last. Similar to the formation of this group of mutated infected, those with higher defense were outside protecting the killing force inside. This time, he aimed for the infected that seemed to have a ranged attack due to the large boil on its neck and spilling fluid from its mouth. Mark did not completely hack the whole head but only sliced from the infected's forehead to the nape of its neck, leaving the boil and the mouth intact. It was to avoid the risk of the seemingly strong acid from suddenly exploding on him. Unlike his previous attacks, however, he did not linger around to hack the others. It was because when the blade on his hand was midway on slicing the head of the acid infected, The other infected around were already attacking him. The moment the blade reached the nape of the acid infected, he vanished into black mist and retreated to the roof of the nearby house. Strange, it was really strange. The speed of Mark's attack was very fast, but the infected around was still able to react in the middle of his attack. It was as if when the acid infected felt the blade touching its forehead, the other infected knew that it was being attacked and they all retaliated. That reaction immediately gave him the feeling that these mutated infected were not only moving as a group but were all connected somehow. Mark disappeared once more, and this time, he appeared in front of an electrical post and kicked it to give him momentum before he vanished in black mist. He then appeared in the middle of the group and swept both his blades, ending the life of 3 mutated infected. However, he needed to vanish once more as several agility types jumped at him at the same time and with the same manner as the first counter-attack he received. Evading the lunge of the agility types, Mark appeared in front of an armor type that had a large body and slow movements. With the momentum he had since he was still midair, he would collide with the armor type. However, he spun his body and kicked the face of the mutated infected that was unable to react, and Mark propelled himself back at the agility types that were still midair after failing their attack on him. Using the momentum of the kick to spin his body like a top, he disappeared, evading several more attacks from below, and appeared in the middle of the agility types that had yet to land back on the ground. With his spinning attack, the bodies of the agility types fell down on the ground in pieces. At the corner of his eye as he cut the agility types, she saw a strange activity at the center of the group. A female infected seemed to be inhaling a large amount of air. Feeling the danger, Mark vanished with only dismembering the arm of the last agility type, and retreated. After he vanished, the attack came. No, it was not just a simple attack. An ear-piercing roar-like screech echoed across the battlefield. If Mark did not vanish in time, that screech should have been able to rupture his eardrums and disorient him. However, that was not the only effect that the screech had. ROARRR. Every infected in the area of 500 meters roared at the same time, which shook the whole battlefield. The eyes of the infected turned red and started to glow despite the light of the sun in the noontime. At the same time, the bodies of the biters and eaters in the area seemed to have a physical boost as their muscles bloated slightly. After their earth-shaking scream, the infected rushed once more towards the defense line in a more aggressive fashion. The change in the battlefield severely affected the defensive forces of the settlement. It was a similar effect of being a foot soldier in a medieval war and seeing a whole battalion of cavalry forces charging towards their troops. The momentum of the defensive forces shrunk to an alarming degree, and the first line of defense was starting to get pushed back. Worried about Emihan and Carla, Mark, who escaped the brunt of the screech, propelled himself up the sky to see the situation in the experiment site. Fortunately, they were still able to handle their area since a lot of buildings prevented the infected from swarming their location. He could also see that Emihan had started to help. Since the soldiers already had more than they could handle, it seemed that Emihan became more considerate and started hurling some of the lighter-bodied infected towards the sea in exchange for more effort due to the distance. Mark felt that it was not the time to be concealing everything and decided to show a bit more. He remaining part of the Defier from his back and held it in his left hand and returned the Slicer for a bit. He then activated the Psi Crystal and released the Lightning Mental Crystal and put the crystal on an indent at the centerpiece of the Defier. Vanishing from the sky, Mark charged back at the strange group of infected and aimed the centerpiece on his hand. With a click, the inner layers opened and the 100 holes of the needle launchers were exposed. At the same time, the Lightning Mental Crystal started to glow with his command. Mark fired all 3 volleys of the needles consecutively, and at the 3rd volley, lightning sparks accompanied the needles. Crack! Crack! Electricity at the voltage on a lightning strike waved through the needles and blanketed the infected. A lot of the infected, whether they belonged to the group or not, were electrified and their bodies shook severely. The horrid smell of burning hair and flesh was sickening, but Mark could not care about it. He wanted to kill these infected as soon as possible. Many were affected by his attack, but there seemed to be those that had resistance to electricity and managed to survive. Still, Mark's eyes became affixed on a certain infected that was exposed after most of the infected in the group died and fell down. It was a girl about 10 years old, and she was exactly at the very center of the group. She did not seem to be a mutated infected, which made it even stranger for her to be in this group. The infected girl saw him falling from the sky and screamed. It was not an attack but a scream of pain. Soon, the reason why these infected were very well coordinated came out. A maggot burst out of the girl's right eye. At the same time, maggots burst out of different parts of the bodies of the remaining mutated infected among the group. To think that it's because of parasites, Mark murmured. Day 36 to 12:51 p.m. Settlement defensive wall, port of Real Settlement, Barangay Ungos, Real, Quezon. General. The center of the first defense line is collapsing. Lieutenant Vargas is requesting to fall back to the second defense line. General. The northern side and the southern side of the first defense line can still hold on. If the center falls back, there will be a hole on the defense of the both sides. Reports came in one by one. Due the sudden change with the behavior of the infected after that deafening roar, the main defense line started to collapse. However, once the central defense retreated, the other defensive lines that were able to hold on would be prone to danger from the opening the central defense abandoned. General Faustino came into a quick decision. Retreat the whole defense line to the second point. Although it will likely implicate those that were still able to hold their positions, we can't just make one side retreat and leave the others. Understand? Sir. Yes, sir. After giving his orders, General Faustino turned to the monitoring personnel. Had anyone found out the reason the infected became stronger and more aggressive? Unexpectedly, the reply came from the side of the scientists. Sir, the cause was within the strange group of mutated infected that Mr. Mark is fighting. That's how is Mark? Sir, he's safe. Rather, he almost annihilated the group already. But there seemed to be something strange going on. The words of the scientist in front of the monitor took the attention of everyone, and they all crowed behind him to see the situation. They were all surprised when they saw the site of the battle, where a lot of mutated infected laid down in the middle of the road with scorched bodies. However, the most surprising thing was that the remaining mutated infected in the group had disgusting wriggling maggot-like worms about the size of a child's arm wriggling on different parts of their bodies. Asterisk asterisk. Parasites. Mark frowned. Their existence made how the infected were able to coordinate with each other rather reasonable, but the method these parasites communicated was still a huge wonder. Furthermore, these were not normal infected parasites but parasites that were never seen before the outbreak. In other words, these were new species of parasites. The parasites looked like oversized maggots to some extent, but their bodies were longer in proportion and had large red heads like a larva of a beetle. And the strangest one was the parasite on the infected girl. It had a red crown like a rooster's on its head. Without a doubt, it was the queen of these parasites. Mark vanished from the top of the electric post he stood on and charged towards the infected girl, intending to kill her. Since this girl was able to survive the electric attack he used to kill the others, he did not bother to use it again. Rather, it was better not to use it on the girl, since even though her tattered clothes were burnt at many parts revealing her childish body, her skin was not damaged at all. Even though she looked like a normal biter, for sure, she was not either. Mark appeared in front of the girl already in a slashing motion. Unexpectedly, the girl jumped back, evading the attack. As she evaded Mark's attack, the remaining mutated infected on the group also jumped in to attack Mark. Different attacks landed on Mark's position. There were acid spits, a flying spike, a punch, and even an infected swiping its claws. Unfortunately for them, Mark had already vanished from the spot. Mark appeared behind the girl and slashed her once more, but she still managed to dodge. The other infected that already managed to recover from their first attacks attacked Mark once more, but as usual, he vanished before any of their attacks hit. He appeared in the air frowning. For sure, the movements and coordination of these infected became faster and stronger. Not only that, but the infected girl was able to react to his appearance and attacks. It the same circumstances with the fused infected when he recovered his empathic ability. While the fused infected entered his mind, he came to a realization. The fused infected was able to react to his attacks due to the fact that it had 6 pairs of eyes on its body, not including the baby inside the fused infected. This time, who knew how many eyes did these parasites had, including the eyes of their hosts? Not to mention that they seemed to have a certain method of communication, and if one of them were able to see Mark, all of them would immediately know and react accordingly. Troublesome. Mark did not want to reveal this one, but he had no choice. He had already put the centerpiece of the Defier back and made the lightning mental crystal return before taking out the photokinesis mental crystal this time. Then, the crystal glowed and Mark vanished from everyone's sight as he fell. Different from his movements before, there was no black mist this time, which made not only the infected but the watching drones unable to react. Optical camouflage. By bending the light around and preventing it from hitting his body, his figure was not reflected towards the lens of both the eyes of the infected and the camera mounted on the drone. It was the technique Alderic used to try and kill Mark back at the temporary settlement in Queens Row Elementary School, an ability that those with high-level photokinesis could use. Mark expected the infected to be lost as their target vanished from their sight, but he was mistaken. When Mark vanished, all the remaining mutated infected of the group encircled the infected girl and protected her. Even though these parasites seemed to be infected, they were smart. Or rather, the queen was smart and was able to command her subordinates with great efficiency. The infected girl was defended, and it was like a turtle shell. Some of the infected climbed over the others and created a mound of mutated infected with the infected girl in the very bottom. Since he was not able to attack the infected girl with the defense they were displaying, Mark started attacking the other infected, trying to whittle their formation. Both the camera on the drone and the infected could not see anyone attacking, but they could see some of the infected had their heads decapitated and flying off while spurting blood. Since there were parts that the heads and necks of the infected could not be attacked, arms and legs also started flying off from the group, splattering blood everywhere. They could not see the enemy, but they were dying one by one. The mutated infected made their defense even tighter, trying to protect their queen. Although it might not be the case, their movements displayed the queen's anxiousness. Mark, on the other hand, did something else while he killed the mutated infected one by one, and it was to kill the escaping maggots on the ground. It would not be good if these parasites escaped and found another host and create disturbance once more. Soon, the queen was already in a state of danger and they still could not see the enemy. It was then that all of the remaining parasites spit out spider web-like threads, which immediately covered their mound and bolstered their defense. Mark tried to cut threads and managed to do so, but he could feel that if he did this on the thicker parts, his blades would likely get stuck due to the stickiness of the threads. It seemed that these infected were playing a game of attrition, or what Mark had thought, but he was mistaken. About a minute later, as he repeatedly tried to cut the threads, the mound shook and the thread split up by itself. It revealed the infected girl that now had 3 pairs of fly-like wings on its back, and the queen parasite could not be seen anymore, and only the hollow eye socket of the girl was left. Creating a loud buzz with her wings, the infected girl flew up in fast speed. She looked at the mound for a second and turned away. There was no doubt, she was trying to escape. Even if no one could see, Mark frowned and he activated his shadow mist movement and tried to chase. However, just like how a fly moved fast while flying, she flew in a very fast speed that even Mark's ability could not chase. Without any other choice, Mark cancelled his optical camouflage and appeared mid-air with his hands outstretched forward and his palms placed side by side facing the direction the queen was escaping. He could not let that infected escape. It was unfortunate that only one ability could be used from the mental crystals in every instance, and he needed to cancel the first one to use the other. The photokinesis mental crystal floated in front of his palm and started glowing with a blinding light that everyone in the settlement could see from the distance. The striking sunlight in the middle of noon further enhanced the light converging on Mark's hands. Ignoring everything, the infected girl continued to fly away, oblivious to what was happening about 100 meters behind her. Shoom! With a shockwave-like sound that echoed across the battlefield, a beam of light about a foot in diameter fired off from Mark's palms. With the speed of light, it immediately caught up behind the girl. The girl managed to hear the sudden sound and reacted and managed to survive, but all her wings were destroyed and even her skin was severely burned. Without the support of her wings to fly, she fell from the sky. After Mark fired off his photon cannon, he vanished into black mist and chased the already falling infected girl. Even though he needed to activate his movement ability several times due to the short distance of the subspace he could travel at a time, he still managed to reach the place where the infected girl fell. Falling from that height, Mark was not surprised that her body was a mangled mess. Her head was split open and her arms and legs were bent on unsightly angles. Even her spine seemed to be dislocated. The infected girl's stomach was bulging, however. Splat! The bulge burst open, revealing a beautiful red-colored insect with 2 pairs of fly wings, a pair of yellow compound eyes, a butterfly's proboscis and a dragonfly's tail about the size of a newborn baby appeared and flew, trying to escape. However, it was not able to. Mark had already sent out his blood whips and constricted the parasite. The blood whip then formed a screen cage and metallized, imprisoning the parasite within. The infected parasite bumped at the metal screen several times in attempt to escape, but it was impossible. With the caught parasite queen on his hand, he returned to the remaining infected of the group but was surprised. The mound covered with sticky thread was still there with the mutated infected inside. He entered the opening without fear and found that all the parasites inside were dead along with their hosts. Looking at the queen that changed its appearance rather fast, it was likely that the parasites sacrificed themselves to give the queen a chance to escape. Without the leaders of the horde, the coordination of the horde crumbled. They were nothing but a large group of overly aggressive infected now. With the firepower of the settlement, they soon managed to whittle away their numbers and maintain their remaining defense line. With his job done, Mark returned to the experiment site and found that Carla was already moving slower than before and the glow on her eyes were weaker. It seemed that she had already consumed her energy due to her relentless fighting. Emihan was also tired. The quantity of infected she blew away was a considerably large number. With her being weakened, Mark managed to drag Carla out of the battlefield and the experiment finally ended. Leaving the assistance troops to continue on defense against the remaining infected, Mark decided to walk back into the settlement with Major Bautista and Joash, who also looked considerably tired. Mark, on the other hand, that did the dangerous battle in the middle of the horde, did not even have a single drop of sweat on his body. Another hour passed on a continuous gunfire and bloodshed. The horde was repelled and the settlement was safe once more. There were casualties both among the soldiers and the hired troops of mutators and evolvers, but that could not be helped. It was a part of their duties and their comrades could not nothing but mourn for their lost lives.